The out of the ordinary, unexpected showdown in Columbus, Ohio State 9-1. That phrase has been uttered a few thousand times in history, but Indiana 10-0. This is a first. That statement could never be made before in the history of Indiana football. We got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports to break it down for us. Pat, big week for you.
Yeah, as you said, surprisingly a big week. We were talking about it while we were in Chicago over the weekend for the Northwestern game. I assume the schedule makers looked at this schedule and were like, all right, we'll put Ohio State, Indiana the week before Ohio State plays Michigan. That will be, a relatively easy build up to that game. In fact, it would have been 3 straight weeks of what you would expected Ohio State to be big favorites in, with Purdue, Northwestern, Indiana, right into Michigan. That is not the way this has turned out. Indiana, number 5 in the country, depending on the rankings you look at. So, yeah, not how we saw this playing out. But I think the Buckeyes, are happy to have a third top 5 game, another opportunity to get a big win. Basically, what Ryan Day has said is the start of the college football playoff kind of run already.
Now, Vegas does still consider Ohio State to be a healthy favorite, but it's not the typical 30 to 35 points against this Indiana bunch. It's about 10.5 right now as it stands. And of course, much has been made of Indiana's schedule. On one hand, of them generally dominating and controlling that schedule up until the Michigan game, but otherwise, they've got one team with a winning record that they've defeated thus far at Washington, 6-5. The total schedule stands at 36-56, 20 games under 500 for the Hoosiers. We'll set up the Buckeyes first. Your thoughts about the Northwestern game, if that told us anything, and kind of where this Ohio State team is headed into this Indiana showdown.
I think the Northwestern game was one of those where you just want to get out of there with a comfortable win. Was it pretty? No. Ohio State took a little time to get going, both offensively and defensively. A topic which I'm going to ask, hopefully, Ryan Day about this week, because it hasn't happened every week. Ohio State got off to a good start at Oregon. Obviously, they end up losing that game, but getting the end zone in their first drive. Penn State, they throw the interception on their first offensive possession, but then they score on the next 2 drives. It's been in some of these games, though, some of these games like Northwestern, Purdue, it's taken a little bit of time for Ohio State to get into the game. But once the Buckeyes have, and it was the case again on Saturday, they kind of start to roll. Ohio State's offense scores on, I think it's 5 straight possessions, 4 touchdowns after the first quarter, where they only had 1 possession. The defense shuts things down after Northwestern's first 2 drives, one which ended in a turnover. The other was Northwestern's only score. So, you see what Ohio State's offense, defense can be, but I do feel like some of these games where they know they're going to win, it doesn't always come out of the gates hot. I think that will need to change probably going forward, starting with Indiana, and then obviously in the rivalry game with Michigan, and maybe Oregon in the Big Ten championship game and the college football playoff. But for the most part, I think Ohio State mostly handled business. I think, reading some concerns from Ohio State fans, the secondary, especially the cornerbacks, seem to be an area that has Buckeye fans a little worried. Understandably, I guess, because some teams have thrown on this team a little bit. But again, I do feel like once Jim Knowles and this defensive staff figure things out in terms of what the other team's doing. And remember, Northwestern, like Indiana this weekend, will have come with a week off to prepare for the game. I do think the Buckeyes adjust well defensively, and obviously they've gotten the offense going in pretty much every game this year.
Yeah, the good and the bad there is that you like the adjustment that the Ohio State defense clamps down after the first drive or 2. But at the same time, again, as you just mentioned, we saw it again against Northwestern, what could have been 2 touchdown drives. Jack Sawyer made a play on the first drive to knock the ball loose, but Northwestern gets inside the 15 after a nice drive, and then they complete another touchdown drive. Ohio State took a bit of a gamble on a 4th down play around midfield, down 7-0. That could have given Northwestern a little bit of hope. It really surged an upset bid, but the Buckeyes converted, and then from there on, pretty much ho-hum to a victory and looked pretty decent doing it. This Indiana bunch, they also have a top 5 ranked defense nationally. They've got some really good players in Aiden Fisher, who up near the Big Ten lead in tackles and solo tackles. He's number one. Mikhail Kamara has 15 tackles for loss and leads the Big Ten in sacks. So this is an Indiana defense. The offense gets the credit, but the Indiana defense right there with Ohio State near the top of the nation.
I don't think many fans, if you haven't really watched Indiana, if you just seen highlights or bits and pieces, I think you've probably seen this offense led by Curtis Rourke. But you're right to point out the defense and kind of where this has stood. A number of guys that transferred in and have become a key part defensively. I think the Hoosiers, traditionally when Indiana's been good, it has been more on the offensive side, right? And there haven't been a ton of Indiana teams that have been this good. But you think back to the team in 2020 with Michael Penix and kind of the way they moved the ball successfully. But this is a team that's going to be one of, at least statistically, the best defenses Ohio State has faced. I put this on our message board on Bucknuts earlier today. I'm having a really hard time determining how good Indiana is. And I think the defensive side of the ball is a good example, just because, as you mentioned at the top, this Indiana team hasn't played the strongest of schedules. The Michigan game, which, Michigan not having the year they had the last few, but still talent-wise was probably the best opponent Indiana's faced. That game was close, especially in the second half. Indiana didn't play well. Was that the case of, okay, maybe Indiana's not as good as we thought and allowing Michigan to move the ball a little bit and do some things? Or was it just one of those days where Indiana had kind of an off performance? I think we don't know that for sure until we get to Saturday and see how these two teams fare. But it's just a tough read, especially for a team with so many new guys, and they're not new anymore now that we're towards the end of the season. But had they played maybe a more marquee non-conference team, or Penn State also earlier this season, I feel like I'd have a better vibe. But some of those wins, which certainly look impressive in terms of the margin, but then you look at, as you said, the records of some of those teams. The Nebraska game, did they just catch Nebraska at the right time? So kind of going back and forth on what I think about this Indiana team. I know they're good. I just don't know how good. And then that obviously impacts what we expect on Saturday.
Number 3 in total defense, number 2 in yards per play, 14th ranked in pass efficiency defense. And I believe Washington's the best offense that they face. Will Rogers, most likely the best quarterback. Maybe Maryland's there as well. The best defense they faced almost certainly has to be Michigan. And they did struggle. They hit them for a couple touchdowns early in that game to go up 17-3, and then nothing after that. Pat, 18 yards in the second half on 25 plays against Michigan, less than a yard per play as they hung on for dear life. And if Michigan had any semblance of an offense, Indiana most likely would have lost that game. So nobody plays perfect games. Ohio State we can all point to the Nebraska game as their bugaboo. And of course, if we make that direct comparison, then Indiana looks like the greatest team of all time. So the offense, though, can threaten this Ohio State defense. You mentioned Curtis Rourke, 21 TDs, 4 picks, an array of decent weapons on the outside. I'm counting 5 guys here at the receiver position, Pat, that have caught between 24 and 38 passes. So a lot of even distribution out of this team.
Yeah, they spread it around for sure. The running game, both of the running backs who play the most, over 100 carries, each have over 505 yards, each have 9 touchdowns. So it's an offense that's similar to Ohio State, kind of an equal opportunity offense. You can't just take one guy away necessarily. Now, again, how will it fare against a defense like Ohio State's? We'll see. But yeah, I think the second half against the Michigan game, was that an aberration, or was that a good Michigan defense? Now, missing Will Johnson, obviously the star cornerback, but was that an aberration, or was that more of what Indiana is going to look like against teams with, at least on paper, more talent? If we're talking about recruiting rankings and those type of things. But yes, I think what they've done, the way they've schemed things in Bloomington this year has been impressive. I think they will, especially with this week off, the Hoosiers will have some stuff cooked up for Ohio State, especially offensively. And, this is this is going to be an interesting one. Penn State didn't have the weapons on the outside to test Ohio State, in terms of receivers and whatnot, other than Tyler Warren. And Indiana certainly has some guys that I think Ohio State will have to be ready for. And Denzel Burke on Saturday against Northwestern gave up a few plays, got pulled from the game. Now, Ohio State is rotating a bit more at corner than they were earlier in the year. Jermaine Matthews Jr. is playing more, and so he'd already come in for Davison Igbinosun. But I asked Ryan Day about that after the game, and he kind of made it sound like this is just part of the rotation and the way that they want to do things now with Jermaine Matthews. I have to think that Denzel Burke was taken out also a little bit for performance reasons. I thought he came back in the second half and played well. Davison Igbinosun commits his weekly pass interference or holding penalty in, I think it was the third quarter, but then breaks up a pass on fourth down. Jermaine Matthews, I thought, had a pretty good game. He did give up some catches. I think PFF credited him with 5 of 8 receptions allowed, and almost a touchdown. But for the most part, I think this secondary is still a talented secondary. And I think when you're playing a team that challenges you a bit more has been when they have tended to rise to the occasion, especially a guy like Denzel Burke, other than those 2 plays against Oregon, which obviously stick out in fans' minds. But this is going to be the test. Since Oregon, this is definitely the best passing attack Ohio State will face. And I think right now that's where you would point to as maybe the weak link in this defense.
Couple of those Northwestern catches, while it was still a ball game, Bryce Kurtz and AJ Henning were pretty impressive grabs along the sideline, pretty acrobatic grabs that I don't know that any cornerback in the nation is necessarily going to break up or contest because they were perfectly thrown and perfectly caught. However, the thing about Denzel Burke, I got to credit him that after the Oregon game, in which that's a pretty embarrassing performance by him. Everyone was talking about it, especially when you tag yourself and others do as well as one of the best in the nation and you get burned a few times. And then the next week, especially against Nebraska in the next couple of games, he really locked in to show himself, as he has in the past, to be a complete cornerback. He was coming up, stuff in the run, making plays behind the line of scrimmage. He was jamming receivers at the line. He was forcing screen plays for only minimal gains or losses. But I was thinking, okay, this is really commendable of him to a certain extent to really dig in and play tenaciously. But this isn't really a situation where he's being tested in the way that he's proven to be vulnerable. So this might be the game that he's got to really show that he's made some improvements.
Yeah, and I think too, we have to remember, one, corners get beat. The best corners in the NFL sometimes get beat. To your point about those throws against Northwestern, some really good throws, some really good catches. Sometimes good offense beats good defense. That's not to absolve Denzel Burke or any of these Ohio State cornerbacks for some mistakes, because there have been those. I also think there was a thread on our message board on Sunday talking about some of the PFF numbers for Denzel Burke, and I alluded to them with Jermaine Matthews. I think sometimes those get taken and put out on social media, on message boards, and you have to have some context with that. The Denzel Burke against Oregon gave up 8 catches on 8 targets for however many yards. Well, at least one of those, and you could argue maybe a couple more. Like there was a pass, I think we talked about this, Mark, the pass to Ferguson out of the backfield. Like that wasn't Denzel Burke's guy. He just ended up being the closest guy to the play and then goes and makes the tackle, but then gets credited for giving up a reception there. And so sometimes I say that to caution people when you see those numbers thrown around, that it's not always, you don't know the assignments. Ryan Day's talked about this with PFF grades and some of the stuff. You don't always know the assignment the player was doing on that. And so you kind of have to make a judgment when these people are reviewing the film and assigning these numbers. But back to my earlier point, you're going to give up some plays. It just happens. Offense is in football these days is the moneymaker, right? So the rules cater to the offensive players and things like that. So I think as long as Denzel Burke is making the plays he's expected to make and not giving up consistent big plays, and we haven't seen that. And even in the Oregon game, second half, he was much better, I thought, than he was on those plays early in the game. I think that's what you expect. It tends to be in some of these big games that the offense, the team that wins is the team that scores more than, really lockdown defense. That's not always the case. We've seen that some this year. So I think, you need your defense to get stops. I think you probably need some turnovers this weekend in opportune times. You need to avoid those on the other side of the ball. But I do think this may be a more offensive shootout type of game than, say, the Penn State game a few weeks back.
Please like and subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. Catch our Wednesday show, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, Buckeyes Live. And, of course, Pats at bucknuts.com on 247 Sports. Get yourself set for the Indiana Showdown. Maybe the numbers that Ohio State fans should pay attention to is the loss column, because, of course, it's pretty remarkable when you look through the last 20 to 25 years since Jim Tressel got this thing rolling. 11-1 has been the most frequent Ohio State season by far. 11-1 or better. So that's kind of the bar. Go 11-1. We went through this college football playoff format leading into the 12-team, looking back and thinking, okay, well, 11-1 is a standard here for this program. 10-2 is going to get you in the playoffs. Lo and behold, that may not cut it. This logjam in the SEC of 10-2 teams, you don't want to get matched up against their schedules and have the College Football Playoff Committee have to sort that out with a late season loss against Indiana. So this is probably do or die.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to mention the hopes of making the Big Ten championship game and getting a chance to avenge that loss to Oregon. It is crazy that we're talking about this with an Indiana game or with an Indiana team and kind of what's all on the line here, as you just laid out, Mark. But yeah, this Buckeye team has to go out and take care of business. And from here on out, it doesn't matter what the games look like. I know Michigan's record isn't good, but that's going to be a game that they are going to bring everything they have, they being the Wolverines. That's the Super Bowl for this team, is the chance to knock off Ohio State and potentially ruin some of this season for the Buckeyes. Ohio State has to get over that mental hurdle. Against Indiana, like, you win by 1 or you win by 20, it's not going to really matter. You're probably still going to be number 2 in the rankings, assuming Oregon continues to win. So you just have to get the job done on Saturday against the Hoosiers. And like I said, they're going to come in with a week off. I'm sure they will have things schemed up. It may not look pretty early as Ohio State tries to adjust to that, but as long as you handle business, I think you feel good coming out of that game, and then you move on to the rivalry game and then hopefully the Big Ten championship beyond that.
Okay, Pat, good to see you. Enjoy the game on Saturday. And of course, we always appreciate you stopping by to break things down for us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Mark.